Our guest today is former Justice of the High Court of Australia, the Honourable Michael Kirby, who has had an illustrious career which includes serving as a President of the New South Wales Court of Appeal, the inaugural Chairman of the Australian Law Reform Commission, and a Judge in the Federal Court of Australia, and a Commissioner for the UN Commission of Inquiry into Human Rights Abuses in North Korea, among many, many other coveted positions. Thank you, Mr. Kirby, for taking the time to speak with us today.
It's my privilege.
So with our first question and setting the tone for this podcast and the series, our focus is on social change. So in your perspective, what is social change and how does it intersect with concepts such as social justice or human rights?
Social change involves alteration in the laws, practices, attitudes, and customs of society. Social justice has a moral component. For example, the creation of the Nazi state in Germany in 1933 was undoubtedly a very large social change, but it wasn't a forerunner to social justice. Social justice implies the concept of norms that are fair, just, and accessible to ordinary people. And that's why there is a real distinction between social change. It might be a change for the worse, and social justice, which by definition is a change for the better in respecting, upholding, protecting the rights of people who are affected.
And in that vein, with continuing with this theoretical discussion about social justice, how does it differ from, say, human rights? I mean, there have been many commentators and academics who have sometimes said that human rights is a bit more of a sanitized version of social justice. That is, it's set by people who already have more power and they're just granting you things that they think are allowable. So for example, Arundhati Roy said in this Sydney Peace Prize speech in 2004, that it's social justice for the rich, but human rights for the poor. But on the other hand, human rights provides you a framework to actually work within. So how do you think that fits in with today's day and age and all the struggles that people are facing?
In fact, the concept of universal human rights is not something that is granted by governments. It is not necessarily something that is expressed in law. In Australia, we don't have, for example, a whole series of human rights protections spelled out in our constitution or even in a federal statute, unlike most other countries. But the notion that human rights pre-existed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is insisted upon in proper analyses of universal human rights. They inhere in people as human beings, and they are not dependent upon governments, although governments may make them more accessible. They may express them in words that can then be used to hold the fire to the feet of government and to insist that universal human rights is protected and upheld. But the two concepts, though they overlapped, they're like circles that overlap one another, but they are not exactly the same.
And in that sort of discussion about Australia not having a Bill of Rights, how do we manage to actually use human rights to further people's position in life? So whether it comes to refugees or it comes to land rights for Indigenous people, how has that framework assisted when it's not something government can be compelled to do by, for example, the judiciary or the media or activists or just the public when they go to the polls every 3 years?
Well, that's a very good question, because the lack of a constitutional set of rights has led Australians, and especially Australian lawyers, to look elsewhere and to try to find the local equivalent or the local expression of the universal human rights that have become such an important feature of the international community in our current age. The adoption by the General Assembly of the United Nations in December 1948 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was something that Australia, one of the foundation members of the General Assembly and of the United Nations, worked towards attaining. And there's a great irony in the fact that in Australia, many of the fundamental human rights are protected. They're protected by the common law, but of course the common law can be overruled by statute. And in the matter of universal human rights, you can, in some instances, appeal to the statements in international declarations and in other statements of principle, including the statements in treaties that Australia has signed with the United Nations. So we can use them, but that is itself a somewhat controversial proposition in some quarters. I attended a conference in Bangalore in India, Bengaluru as it now is, in 1988 for the purpose of trying with other judges of high courts around the world, particularly in Commonwealth countries, to express the ground rules for the use of international human rights principles, especially in the circumstances that there is no constitutional norm that you can appeal to, no provision of a statute that clearly applies, and no statement of the common law. The propositions advanced by the judicial group in Bangalore was that in such circumstances you could reach for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the other statements of human rights in order to assist in the interpretation of the Constitution, the explanation of a statute, or the elaboration of a principle of the common law. But the High Court of Australia has been rather resistant to that notion. Not always, because in the Mabo decision in 175 Commonwealth Law Reports, 1 at 42, Justice Brennan, who wrote the leading opinion in that case, said that the one principle of universal human rights that cannot be breached is the principle that people are equal and that they do not lose that equality by reason of their race. And that he used as the principle to provide the key to unlock the door that permitted the High Court in that case to override 150 years of common law and to hold that land rights could not be denied to the Indigenous people, the First Nations people, on the basis of the race, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander race of the people affected, but that statement of the old common law had to be overruled and replaced by a racially neutral principle, and indeed one that upholds the human rights of the Indigenous people to land and to the exercise of those rights according to their customs. So there's been a sort of inconsistency in the way this has been dealt with by courts. The Supreme Court of the United Kingdom only in the last weeks has expressed a view which is somewhat hostile in the opinion of Lord Reid, the President, to the Bangalore idea. But I have no doubt that given time, that idea, which is a reflection of the very development of international law and of international law of human rights in recent decades will come to be accepted and will be an important influence that judges and lawyers look to when they come to understand the meaning of a statute, the meaning of the common law, and even the meaning of the Constitution of 1901.
In terms of the legal system on a domestic level and bringing change through that, one vehicle has been public interest litigation strategies. And over the course of your career, you must have seen that being put into place either by your peers or from afar. Firstly, how would you define public interest litigation for our audience? And secondly, I'm curious about your thoughts as to whether you think it's legal change that inspires social change or if it's the other way around, and if this is very case dependent.
I think it's an interactive mechanism of law. We lawyers like to think we're terribly important. We're the center of the universe, and therefore we have the keys to advance the kingdom. And many lawyers think that's the most important. And there's no doubt that the law can play a very important role. And public interest litigation is a way that ordinary people with legal problems and yet generally needing support from lawyers, and mostly lawyers acting pro bono, can bring cases to courts, and by the authoritative decision of our courts can then see advances. Now, this is not something that is very recent. Even when I was a young lawyer and was elected the president of the Students' Representative Council at the University of Sydney, I became involved in litigation involving students. And this was litigation often to challenge decisions where the student claimed to be a conscientious objector. And that was a very little case in the local Court of Petty Sessions, as it was called then, the local court. And this tiny little case, nonetheless, was advancing the principle of respect for people's conscientious objection to involvement in wars, or particularly the Vietnam War. And I remember when I was president of the SRC, we went down to a television studio and we went through film footage that was made available to us by the television studio, which showed the circumstances of an arrest at Wynyard Square in Sydney of students who were protesting against Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War and protesting against the compulsory obligation to perform the national service if your number came up in the ballot. And this action, again, a very tiny little action. It never made the headlines. No one ever saw it on television. No one ever made a big fuss about it. But that's what I was doing as the president and later the honorary solicitor of the SRC of Sydney University. And likewise, there was a case in Walgett in New South Wales where Aboriginals were not allowed to go upstairs in the local cinema. They could go downstairs where there was lino on the floor and vinyl on the seats. But climbing up the grand and beautiful staircase to the cinema in Walgett and plonking yourself down in the velvet seats with carpet on the floor, that was impermissible. Aboriginals stay out. And we gave support, and I was briefed in the matter, to the students who, hand in hand, this was a very symbolic thing, makes me emotional even to think back to it, who walked up the grand staircase. The white students bought the cinema tickets, but they walked up the staircase with local students not university students, because we had precious few of them, who were Aboriginal, and they were then arrested by police for taking Aboriginals up. We were assured that the Aboriginals would watch the same movie and they would not be interfered with, and it's quite nice downstairs. But the students were arrested. Some of them were law students, so an arrest and a record was a very bad thing. And so I briefed Gordon Samuels, later the Chancellor of UNSW. And he was a leading barrister, the president of the bar, and he did the case for nothing, went up to Walgett. We argued the case as a matter of law. In the end, we lost, but the magistrate did not impose a criminal conviction. And a week after the decision of the magistrate, the owner of the cinema announced that discrimination against Aboriginals upstairs was over. And so things changed. The
Mm.
moral of the story is we can say these are just little things, but our duty as human beings, our moral obligation, and above all, our professional duty as lawyers is to undertake such cases, bring them to courts, appeal to courts, do the very best of lawyering to try and convince the court. But even sometimes when you lose, you win. And that is a very important lesson I learned quite early in my career. I would have only been about your age at the time that happened. This was about 1962 or so. I was
Wow.
23.
Wow, that's incredible to hear, and I think it sort of goes back to the whole theme of this podcast, which is hope, because and I think this goes back to our chats before we recorded today's episode about how it feels like there is so much that's wrong with the world. I mean, for instance, if you're looking at the um, around the 60s and onwards, there was the apartheid in South Africa, there was the Vietnam War. There was just so much going on at the same time. Gay people were still, persecuted by our legal system. Indigenous people didn't even have land rights for most of those 5 decades. How did lawyers such as yourself or other people who wanted to make a change really sort of see a light at the end of the tunnel? Is it really analogous to some of the issues we might see today? And is the fact that we are so overwhelmed by so much information through the internet and social media a different environment to really grapple with your sense of identity and your sense of purpose as a lawyer or change maker in the world compared to how it was when you were starting off as a lawyer?
I don't think it's different in the slightest. We have our problems today. Take, for example, Afghanistan and the Taliban regime, the retreat of the Western countries, all in a scramble, the many women judges who appealed for protection, the relative reluctance of Australia to protect everyone, the fact that the ambassador left, leaving in the embassy the people who had trusted in Australia to protect the local staff. And now the International Bar Association, of whose Human Rights Institute I was co-chair until very recently, adopted a policy to try to offer exit visas to those who were at special risk. And that included women who had been judges, something which was denied by the Taliban in their former regime, and also to gay people in Afghanistan. We didn't give many visas. We are very parsimonious with our visas, but
Mm,
we can make a great fuss, and civil society can make a fuss. And organizations such as the International Bar Association, its Human Rights Institute, but also Amnesty International, and the International Commission of Jurists, and the local Council for Civil Liberties, the PIAC, the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, which has had a great participation from UNSW. All of these were mobilised, and they're still working to improve the situation of human rights in the world today. And that is not always easy, and it often fails. But unless you get off your backside and try to do something, nothing is going to happen, and people are going to suffer great injustices. And that's why I found the secret I found was to join the Council for Civil Liberties, and the ICJ and Amnesty and so on. They were not very busy in Australia at that time. And the political parties were often very ambivalent about the types of issues that we raised. But that was what I did. I joined the CCL. And, when I look back on those meetings of the Council for Civil Liberties, there we all were in a rather dingy office in the city. And if I look back on it, virtually all of those who were at the meetings, chaired by Justice Robert Hope, who was later my colleague on the Court of Appeal, virtually all of them, or most of them, became judges. It's a good thing. They became troublemakers. They became visible. They were standing up, and they were often reluctantly admired for
Mm.
doing this and for pushing our society, which is a prosperous, well-governed, sort of reluctant type of society, into doing the right thing. I think Australians do like the right thing to be done. They're sometimes worried about the cost, and they're sometimes worried about the consequences. But I think there is a deep well of support with young people with enthusiasm and dedication and cleverness to bring their skills to bear, to bring justice to the disadvantaged.
Mm. And I think a good lesson to take away from that is, I mean, it's really easy to feel overwhelmed by so many different issues, but we do have to get involved and focus on at least one thing and take initiative. But stepping away from the law for a second, business is another very powerful way of making a difference. So let's take animal welfare, for instance. There's been a high growth in consumer demand for so-called imitation meats. So, for example, Beyond Meat, and increasing market activity when it comes to alternatives to leather. For example, all the research that's going into mushroom leather. But I'm quite curious from a philosophical perspective. So, whereas the ethical argument for less meat consumption, for example, hasn't really energized people to the same extent as the environmental argument has, is there a risk in terms of shifting away from the ethical foundation of this sort of consumer demand, or do we have to be more results focused and not as focused on principles? Another analogy is, for example, people who might argue that we need more refugees because that can assist us with our economic prosperity, especially in the regions. But others might say, well, that goes away from the principle of refugee protection and our duty towards protecting people. How do you feel about that?
I think there is a little bit of both. I think there is principle and there is pragmatism. A.J. Brown, in his book on my life, rather cruelly gave it the subtitle Principles and Pragmatism. And okay, my life has had its pragmatic elements, and I'm not ashamed of those. But it's also had its moments of principle. And I'm certainly not ashamed of those. Unfortunately, we live in a country where the judiciary is not corrupted. It's a very rare thing in Australia for the judiciary to be corrupted. And this means that our judges, you may not like what they write, but at least you have the knowledge in the back of your mind that these are honest, hardworking, serious people who are trying to reach the decision as they understand the law. They may not have the same view of the law as I do, and that's how it works out in life. Maybe if they had had my experience with the law, maybe if, like me, they had grown up being gay and knowing that the law was against you and was highly punitive and was lying like a trap in wait to snap your head off and to punish you and throw away the key. So, or if you were Aboriginal, to remove from you equality before the law simply because of your Aboriginality, or with women removing equality and imposing laws that were unequal for women and so forth. So I think you've got to do things. You've got to get off your backside and do things. And I have to say, speaking completely candidly, I didn't do much about sexuality when I was a young person. Nobody did. If I think back on the Council for Civil Liberties meetings, we talked a lot about Aboriginals. We talked a lot about white Australia. We talked a lot about women's rights. Um, Refugees were not such a big issue there. We talked about conscientious objection, the Vietnam War, nuclear weapons, and so on. But we said nothing about gay rights. And I said nothing about gay rights, even though it was something that was very much affecting me. And it's led me to be really conscious of the fact that sometimes you have to be brave, and you've got to be strong, and you've got to take risks that you'll upset people, including maybe your parents. But you can do things in a loving and respectful way, but you can stand up for what you conscientiously believe is the right thing. And I wish I had done more when I was growing up. It's getting a bit late in the day for me, but at law school, I never put my hand up and asked, why did we not recognise Aboriginal title? Never. No one did. Silence. Likewise, white Australia. Likewise, women's inequality, and especially the no-no subject of gay rights. All of those things I was silent about. But then I got into the Council for Civil Liberties, and we started to talk about gay rights. And it was a lot of people, including very fine people, were opposed to that. They thought it was disgusting, and they didn't really want that. They had religious preachers, they're still there, sounding off against gay people as an abomination. But looking back, I wish I had been stronger and earlier. But if I had been, I think the truth of the matter is I would not be sitting here being interviewed as a former president of the Court of Appeal and former justice of the High Court. So you have to be a little bit strategic, but you've also got to be principled. And on the last week that I served as a justice of the High Court, I did two big things. One, I sat in the Wurrajil case, which was the challenge to the legality or constitutionality of the Northern Territory intervention. Very important case. I hope it's not forgotten. And two, I went to launch at Sydney University a book on animal welfare law in Australia and New Zealand. And after that night, I'd read this book. I had no idea the conditions of slaughtering and the cruelty to sentient animals. And I have not eaten any meat since that time. I tried to persuade my nephew, who's about your age, to do this. And he said, I know I should, but I just like the taste of meat too much. And so you've got to start somewhere, and you've got to try to influence others. I strongly support what business has done with meat-like substitutes. And I can affirm that at least some samples of vegetable bacon, for example, tastes so much like the real thing that I feel guilty when I taste it and enjoy it in an omelette. Uh, it's a question: should I not even go there on the basis that this is really breaching the principle? This is what you're interested in.
Hmm.
But if it gets people out of meat eating, reduces the slaughter of so many sentient animals, and improves the treatment of those animals that are in this regime, then it's a very good thing. And it is growing. It's growing quite rapidly. And I recommend it to anybody who listens to this podcast. If you like the taste of it, then you can take artificial bacon and it is exactly the same taste. It's amazing. It's made out of soy. I don't know how they do it. It's made by the Sanitarium Company, which are the Seventh Day Adventists, I think, and they are strict vegetarians. And they're not therefore using um, live animal extracts of any kind, but they've found a way to make soy into an animal tasting food. And we should all be eating more of it and less of a real meat.
Hmm. Yes, I mean, in terms of the results that these imitation meat companies have gotten and the amount of transitions they managed to foster, no one can really argue with the numbers when it comes to taking a more pragmatic approach, especially with a practice that is so deeply entrenched in our culture. In terms of looking at social change, in terms of the individual level, so looking at just what I could do or my friends could do on a day-to-day basis, I'm quite aware of the fact there's a strong emphasis on social change in legal education. I didn't really see that come through in my commerce degree, for instance. It's not really something that's explored as much in other areas of study, unfortunately. But there are various ways you can make a difference that doesn't mean you have to be a lawyer. What lessons would you pass on to people who see a social issue that should be addressed? So whether that's regarding water and soil pollution in a regional mining town, or for example, with the stories that's coming out right now about people in the Park Hotel in Melbourne who've been in our immigration detention system for over 9 years. What would you pass on to them that you've seen happen, whether it's through, for example, your friends with the freedom rides back when you were at UCID as a student, or any other movements that have taken place since?
Well, the lesson is to be a joiner, to get involved so that you begin to see issues. If you don't see issues, you can't really be morally criticized for being quiet about them. But if you see issues and you begin to discuss them with your colleagues, and then you see a way through the issues, and that way will not always be as easy as artificial meat, but it will often be standing up for what is right, even though that is going to upset people, people close to you, even. So I think this is the lesson of my life. And curiously, the fact that I was, uh, if you like to call it this, a kind of respectable troublemaker. I was the president of the SRC. I was a law student. I was pretty obviously on the way to the golden path for success in the legal profession. And yet I began to make trouble with my fellow students. And I think that helped me to be noticed. Um, for example, Neville Wran, who was then a young, up and coming QC and a member of the state parliament, um, he'd heard about me in the media because the media was always attacking me and saying I was a pompous git and that I should come down from my high horse, and they might have had a point, but uh, I, uh, I I got noticed, and I'm not saying that's why so many people who were involved in the Council for Civil Liberties were appointed judges, but not everybody wants to be a judge. And some people increasingly nowadays don't want to be judges. But if you want to contribute to our society by ultimately being considered for judicial office, um, then maybe if you join a political party, you'll get noticed by people. But if you are a person who has been noted in general society, including by politicians who have the ultimate say in Australia for the appointment of the judiciary, then that's a byproduct. It's not a reason for getting involved, but it is a consequence. It's just amazing to look at the lists of the Council for Civil Liberties circa 1965 to 75. They all ended up distinguished judges, uh,
Hmm.
and uh, and it's not a bad thing in a country to infuse a number of people with that outlook in the judiciary. I probably would have had the outlook anyway because I was gay, and that made me sensitive to injustice and not liking it and wanting to do something about it. But starting on the ground floor, maybe even in the basement, is a difficult step, and it must often seem as though it leads nowhere and it requires a lot of extra work, and you don't have to do it. You could be out there sending off text messages and social media and all the other things that you young people do, but give a bit of time to disadvantaged people, and there will always be disadvantaged people. And if you do that, then it's likely that your life will be fuller, your life will be richer in the spiritual sense, and also that you'll make a contribution to your own well-being and to that of your society.
Hmm. I think there's a very good lessons to take away from there, especially in terms of taking initiative, and just being a joiner and getting involved, because we all have the right to do so. We all should take ownership of changes in our society. What I want to
Yes,
end on.
you're doing so in this podcast series, and it's a good thing. And I expect if I hang around for another 20 years, which I'm intending to do, that I will see you in a leadership position. But if you don't get there, or if you don't want to get there, or you think the sacrifices personally are too great, then that's good. That's fine. But at least you've made a contribution back to society. And that's what we should all do, and especially young lawyers. I think young economic students and commerce students should have their minds open to social issues. Business is doing so, and maybe that's something, Sanjay, that you should be doing. And I'll come with you because I have a Bachelor of Economics degree from Sydney University, and we should go and say you should be introducing social justice issues because it's going to be increasingly important to business people, men and women in business, and that's what we should get that message over.
Hmm. And with that, you already foreshadowed one of our later guests. So we'll be looking into pro bono done at law firms and with the emerging culture of corporate social responsibility, especially, for example, with energy policies and environmental issues. It's been the private sector that's led the way rather than government, at least in Australia in the last couple of decades. So yeah, I'm very keen for those discussions as well. And thanks so much for the kind words. What I'm also very interested in, though, to finish up, is uh, who would you say is a role model you've looked up to when you were sort of um, at uni, or you're on the trajectory to your meteoric rise through public office after public office? And what's one person or what's one organization you've got your eye on to change things in the coming years?
Well, first of all, you say my rise was meteoric, to me, it was a very slow-moving meteor. At least that's how it seemed to me at the time. You can't expect everything to work out beautifully and quickly. And I don't think I did that, and I wasn't doing it in order to be noticed. But I was just saying that this is a consequence of being a joiner and being involved in the social issues of the day. For the people whom I admired, they certainly would have included Lionel Murphy. Now, Lionel was a very unusual man, and he was a person who liked me. I never quite knew why he liked me, because he was a great party goer, and I was always a party pooper. And he liked me and he gave me opportunities, but he was also a fresh thinker. And this is the problem in the law: thinking freshly, challenging yourself. What is a fresh insight about this area of the law? And what does this feel like to people who are on the receiving end of the law? I think Chief Justice Mason was a very great judge in Australia. He was the judge when Mabo was decided. He joined with Justice Brennan and Justice McHugh in the key reasons in that case. Justice Dean was a very great lawyer. And looking at the other people who intersected with my life, Julia Stone had a very big impact on me at law school. So look to your academic leaders and those who are teaching how we have to make a contribution to improving the law and improving social justice. I mean, there are many people, many women who have greatly influenced my life, and I'm grateful to them all. As to the future, I do think animal welfare is going to be an increasing subject because, as you've said, it's very important for climate change issues, but it's also important for the issue of principle that is involved. I believe that refugees and living up to the principles of the Refugee Convention and Protocol, that's extremely important. And as you've said, that can be argued both as a matter of principle and also as a matter of pragmatism in a country which has an increasing aged population, which it doesn't always treat very well. But one of the issues that I've tried to speak of and engage people with is nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament and getting the countries with nuclear weapons to surrender them, and those that don't have them to adhere to the principle and the letter of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. You know, I got them in the Institute of Human Rights in the International Bar Association to put this on the agenda of the last big conference that we had in Rome. This was before COVID really struck. And whereas sessions on the principle of bias in arbitrations and matters of that kind packed the conference hall, for the session which we had on nuclear weapons, I think we got about a dozen people, even though there were some leading speakers. It just doesn't engage with people, no doubt, because they think, what can I do about nuclear weapons? Well, the lesson of my life is what you can do is start making a fuss and start putting things onto the political agenda so the cautious, nervous politicians cannot avoid the issue anymore. If we don't cure and solve the nuclear weapons issue, you can forget about all the others, because the nuclear weapons will see the end of this species on Earth. And that's why the present is a very worrying time, with two leaders who have an investment, maybe three leaders who have an investment in being tough guys. Well, the days of tough guys really went out with Hiroshima, and we have to find ways that even with horrible countries like North Korea, we can find a way to remove the danger of nuclear weapons, which are so devastating in their impact and so long-term in their consequences. So there are just a few ideas, but there are plenty more. And I'm sure the young people who are listening to this podcast will have ideas of their own, which don't even occur to me. But if you ask, what do you hope you can continue to contribute to? I would say nuclear weapons removal from our midst. And I don't think that's something that cannot be tackled because it's just too big. It requires leadership from politicians and a belief that the people who elect them are deeply concerned about it. And I think we're going to see that issue played out in the questions that are raised by the situations on the border of Ukraine and Russia. So plenty to do, lots of ideas. Don't be boring. Open your mind to new ideas. Be brave. Be braver than I was. Speak up for the things that affect you and don't be ashamed of it. And I hope that your life will be as rich in spiritual terms as mine has been.
And with that, thank you so much for joining us for our first episode of the podcast, Michael Kirby. We really appreciate your presence on this episode, and I'm sure our audience will take a lot away from the lessons that we've learned today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanjay.